Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, we're looking at a video on the Answers in Genesis Canada channel called The Unbelievable New Reality of Public Schools. Christians be warned. So we can guess that this is going to be all about how secularism is a religion that is being cloaked in the disguise of neutrality, all while being completely oblivious to the fact that they would freak the fuck out if a Muslim teacher were to start teaching their kids about how great Muhammad is using the same logic that they use to get to the idea that creationism should be taught in the classroom. So let's take a look.
Try asking your Christian friends or family members this question. Would you send your children to an exclusively Muslim school that taught the Quran as plainly written? My bet is that most of them would respond with a resounding no.
Okay, you know what? I'm man enough to admit when I'm wrong. They are not oblivious to the fact that they'd freak out about that. They are crashing face first into that fact while not understanding why that works against them.
But why? Well, most would likely explain it's because the school's teachers would invariably instruct their children in what they consider to be a false religion, and of course the corresponding values that emanate from its beliefs. They would recognize that the constant negative influence their children would have to deal with on a day-to-day and hour-to-hour basis could have disastrous spiritual results.
And those Muslim teachers are just as certain that Islam is the one true religion as you are that Christianity is the one true religion. Now, let me ask you, Calvin, is that something that you actually want the government adjudicating? Just think of it from the perspective of evangelizing. Would it not make it easier to spread Christianity and save souls if the governments of countries controlled by the Islamic State were, not controlled by the Islamic State, but were instead secular? It's a lot easier to share your religion with people when you don't have to stare down the barrel of a gun in order to do so, is it not? But the people in charge of the Islamic State are just as convinced about the correctness of what they are doing as you are. And it seems that any time religion gains political power, it uses that power to violently oppress members of other religions. Sure, some of their holy texts make it easier to justify than others, but even Buddhism, which is largely seen as a very peaceful religion, when it has political power in places like Myanmar, ends up with genocidal tendencies. So, yeah. Keep religion out of the government, keep it out of the classroom, and leave it to the individuals. If your religion requires government-backed coercion in order to survive, then this might be a hot take, but your religion shouldn't survive.
Every parent knows that biblically, there's no such thing as neutrality.
Yes, there is. When teaching a kid how to read, religion is not required. When teaching them math, religion is not required. When teaching them art, religion is not required. These things can all be done neutrally. The only time religion comes into it is when you have religions like young earth creationism, for example, which deny reality. In those cases, teaching reality is still neutral on the teaching side of things. It's the religion that has the neutrality issue. And in this case, that religion needs to take it up with reality rather than the teachers.
After all, serious students of the Bible will remember Christ's words. Whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. Luke 11, verse 23.
Yeah, Jesus is a Sith Lord. We all know that.
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy. Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
But the real world is not so black and white. That is exactly the kind of thinking that leads to theocracies opposing minority groups, because obviously that minority isn't with the dominant religion, so they must be against them. And what does Jesus say to do to enemies? Bring them before him and slaughter them at his feet. Sure, that was in a parable, so it is not necessarily meant to be taken as a literal command to slaughter non-Christians, but it most definitely can be interpreted that way, especially when combined with the "anyone not with me is against me" rhetoric.
It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that you don't want your impressionable kids to be negatively influenced.
It also doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that no matter how thoroughly you shelter your child, they will be negatively influenced at some point in their lives. So it's better to equip them with the skills necessary to navigate such influences rather than raising them isolated and alone. And there's also a trade-off. The degree of protection required to shield them from all negative influences will itself become a negative influence on them, leaving them unprepared for life if taken to the extreme. The parent's job is to find the balance, and it is a tricky one at times.
We know that even brief exposure to things like pornography can have devastating effects on young minds.
Yes, I'll agree that viewing porn at a young age can have negative consequences, but again, this is one of those things that is almost certain to happen at some point. So my choices as a parent are either to shield my kid from everything and not even mention porn to them at all, leaving them completely unprepared to deal with it when they inevitably come across it, or to educate them about it in an effort to minimize the negative consequences.
So, good parents stay vigilant to prevent them associating with others that might attempt to introduce wrong ideas to them.
If only it were so simple. Doesn't matter how vigilant I am, the fact that they associate with other kids means that sometimes those other kids will be a bad influence on them. Also, I'm not one of those parents who can't be convinced that my children are anything but perfect angels. I know for a fact that mine will sometimes be the bad influence. And while I am sure that the people over at AIG would be quick to blame my parenting for the fact that they will sometimes be the bad influence, I recognize that kids are kids. It doesn't matter how well you raise them, they will make bad choices sometimes.
It's why God's word says, "Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals." 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33.
It also says to beat your kid with a rod if you love them, so forgive me for not taking my parenting advice from the Bible.
Having your child in that situation would obviously not be an unbiased environment, and having to attempt to counter the indoctrination imposed on those young minds from many hours of that religious education in the small amount of time left over at the end of the day would be extremely difficult, even for the most vigilant parents. Most Christians would concede they wouldn't expect positive spiritual results and would be very hesitant to try it out.
All the more reason to keep religion out of school entirely.
Of course, despite the fact that statistics continue to show that more than 70% of young people from Christian homes that attend public schools walk away from the faith of their parents, the vast majority of Christians in the West seem to have no problem sending their children to secular, state-run schools for an education.
I'm having a hard time finding that figure in any of the statistics on the matter. There are a few places it could be from. The Southern Baptist Convention, for instance, found that 70% of kids who were active in youth group stopped attending church after high school. But when I say they found that, what I actually mean is that that number was thrown out there without a reference in a document titled Remarks to the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee in 2001, and blogs like J. Warner Wallace's cite that as their source for the 70% number. Then there was a Lifeway research survey from 2007, which was actually a survey with over 1,000 participants, so we're getting closer to actual statistics here, and this one found that 70% of kids could be categorized as church dropouts after high school. They considered a kid active in church if they had attended at least twice a month for at least 1 year during high school, and they considered them to have dropped out if their attendance dropped below that for at least a year between the ages of 18 and 22. So, what that means is that if you went to church more than twice a month for grade 9, but then the rest of high school you didn't set foot in a church, and then when you graduated high school you started attending church once a month, you would be considered a church dropout in this survey. Also, the Barna Group have a couple of surveys where they found that church dropout rates of 18 to 29-year-olds increased from 59% to 64% between 2011 and 2018. But while these studies did find similar-ish numbers in similar age groups, one thing did stand out to me. Not one of them distinguishes between public schools and private schools. Now, maybe Calvin is referencing a survey that I just haven't been able to find. It sure would be helpful if he included any sort of citation showing where he got it from, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say that, yes, he has a proper study with no methodological problems that found that 70% of kids who attended specifically the secular state-run schools, as he put it, leave the church after high school. Well, given that all of the other data found similar results when they did not distinguish between types of schools, that is, they presumably included private schools in their sample, it stands to reason that the type of school you attend does not have much of an impact on whether or not you stay Christian after high school. Now, I could very well be wrong here. Statistics aren't exactly my strong suit, but my point is that Calvin is not citing his sources, and the sources that I found did not distinguish between public and private schools. So at best, we can say that this is inconclusive and needs more study. But keep in mind, as he goes through his video railing against public education, that he doesn't actually have adequate data to back up the idea that a public education leads to apostasy any more than a private one does.
Why? Seemingly because they deem public schooling as irreligious and not faith-based.
And that's the way it should be.
And this is apparently due to a foundational misunderstanding of what faith and religion are.
Oh, brother, here we go. Lack of religion is a religion, therefore there's no such thing as a secular education, so my religion has to take precedence over all of the other ones.
Most people's understanding of religion presupposes a belief in a particular god or pantheon of gods, but this is untrue. For example, in an article exploring one of the world's foremost religions, National Geographic stated, "Buddhism is one of the world's major religions. Buddhists do not believe in any kind of deity or god."
Correct. Non-theistic religions are a thing that exists, though I'm not used to this. It's usually me pointing that out in response to some apologists claiming that the problem of evil doesn't address a lot of non-Christian religions or something. Because, yeah, it's a response to the claim of a tri-omni God. It's not meant to work against those other ones. But at least Calvin's recognizing that non-theistic religions exist?
Other examples of non-theistic religions would be Jainism and even subsects of Hinduism, which are compatible with atheism.
Again, correct. As I've mentioned numerous times on my channel, atheism is not a monolith. My go-to example here is a woman that I used to work with who called herself an atheist and believed that we are all trans-dimensional immortal beings who use mortality as a sort of entertainment. Wipe your memory, enter into the mortal realm, and then live your life. When you die, you go back to your immortal existence with a bunch of new stories about your mortal experience. Bit unconventional to be sure, but as she did not believe in any theistic deity, technically, she was an atheist. Well, same thing here. If a religion does not contain a theistic deity, then it could potentially be compatible with a label of atheistic religion. Now, a religion being compatible with atheism does not mean that atheists will all agree with that religion, or that one atheistic religion must necessarily be compatible with all the other atheistic religions. So what Calvin is doing here is emphasizing the herd of cats nature of atheism. Literally the only thing that all atheists will agree on is that there is no theistic God. And even then you'll have atheists disagreeing about whether lack of belief atheism actually counts as atheism, or if it only counts if you have a positive atheist position where you assert that there is no God, rather than simply not believing in any of the God claims that you are aware of. Also, for the record, they have framed all of their B-roll footage in such a way that the tops of most people's heads are out of frame. It looks awkward, and I just want you to know that that was them, not me.
So, a religion need not adhere to the concept of a supernatural intelligence. Merriam-Webster's non-deistic definition of religion is simply a cause, principle, or system of beliefs held to with ardor and faith.
Right. And you'll notice that, while that definition will apply to atheistic religions, it does not apply to the general concept of atheism. How do you hold to a lack of belief with ardor and faith? I just don't believe you when you say there is a God. I don't have faith that you're wrong. I don't hold to the belief that you are wrong with ardor. I just think you're wrong. But also, this definition is so watered down that it essentially makes religion synonymous with passionate. And you can see this when you look at the examples that Merriam-Webster provides. Hockey is a religion in Canada. Politics are a religion to him. High school football is religion. Food is religion. Now, I figure he's about to equate secular with religious atheism, using the definition of religion that equates to passionate, and thus argue that it needs to be kept out of schools. But if that's the route you're taking, then by the same logic, anything that anyone could be passionate about needs to be kept out of schools. Art? Nope. Sports? Hell no. Math? Are you kidding me? Have you seen the guys on the Numberphile channel? Way too much passion for math there. Literature? Absolutely not. Basically anything. I guess you just can't educate kids because any subject could become their passion, and that's the same as a religion, which honestly might be the creationist goal, as an uneducated public is way easier to turn into a young earth creationist public.
Another very popular non-theistic religion is secular humanism. And although some secular humanists vehemently howl against the accusation, humanism makes overtly religious statements and is even recognized as a religion by the US Supreme Court.
Yes, humanism is recognized as a religion, but that's mostly because the American courts give special treatment to religions, thanks in large part to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. If you're an employer who doesn't want to pay for employee insurance that covers contraceptives and just happen to be Christian, then you just need to go to court and explain that such things are against your sincerely held religious beliefs, and presto, you no longer have to cover an important part of people's healthcare, all thanks to your religious freedom. Secular religions like humanism are a response to the special treatment. It's almost entirely a defense mechanism.
For example, the Humanist manifesto describes it in the following way. Religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Humanism believes that man is part of nature and that he emerged as the result of a continuous process. We find insufficient evidence for the belief in the existence of the supernatural. It is either meaningless or irrelevant to the question of survival or fulfillment of the human race. As non-theists, we begin with humans, not God. Nature, not deity.
Worth mentioning is that all of those quotes are either from the first or second iteration of the Humanist Manifesto, published in 1933 and 1973, respectively. They are entirely absent from the most recent iteration, which was published in 2003. Interesting that he had to go back to documents that, if you access them on the American Humanist Association's website today, they all have a disclaimer at the top stating that they have been superseded instead of going directly to the superseding document. And this is likely because, as it turns out, the current iteration of the Humanist Manifesto does not even mention religion, instead opting to call itself a philosophy. Because, honestly, aside from the quirkiness that is the American judiciary, philosophy is a better word for it than religion. Because the thing is, the values espoused in the Humanist Manifesto are all values that could be incorporated into most existing religions. Things like, we are committed to treating each person as having inherent worth and dignity. We aim for our fullest possible development and animate our lives with a deep sense of purpose, finding wonder and awe in the joys and beauties of human existence. Humanists long for and strive toward a world of mutual care and concern, free of cruelty and its consequences, where differences are resolved cooperatively without resorting to violence, and so on. There are no values that are exclusive to humanism. Like, for comparison, to be a Christian, you kinda have to believe in that whole Jesus thing. And aside from a few fringe quacks, you won't find anyone who believes in the whole Jesus thing, but doesn't call themselves a Christian. But you can find all sorts of people from all sorts of religions who find themselves in agreement with most, if not all, of the principles laid out in the Humanist Manifesto. Go ahead and give it a read. It is short, and it is way better than any other religious text that I have ever read. There may be a few places where I'd be inclined to quibble with the wording, but I can say that it's a good document without then having to make excuses for why slavery or genocide are sometimes okay, like you do if you want to call the Bible the good book.
Of course, the term non-theist is simply a different way to say atheist, which is defined as a person who denies or disbelieves the existence of a supreme being or beings.
Notably, non-theist is also absent from the current manifesto. But if I were to pop back into the second one for just a moment, I would probably argue that their use of non-theist instead of atheist is meant to include more people. People who might not be willing to call themselves atheists, but still don't believe in a god, like agnostics, for instance.
So the main point of humanism is that it denies God as its starting point, which means the nature is all that is mantra they hold to is paramount in their thinking.
If you read the whole paragraph where the non-theist quote was found, you'll find that it begins by saying, "In the best sense, religion may inspire dedication to the highest ethical ideals. The cultivation of moral devotion and creative imagination is an expression of the genuine spiritual experience and aspiration." So yes, that iteration of the Humanist Manifesto does explicitly deny God, but it acknowledges good that can come from religion. And if we were to pop back into the modern version of the manifesto, it no longer explicitly denies God, but it is explicitly secular. That is, irreligious. Though, again, toward the end, it does offer an olive branch to religion by saying, "Humanists are concerned for the well-being of all, are committed to diversity, and respect those of differing yet humane views." In other words, as long as your religion does not promote cruelty, there's no conflict to be found with humanism. And it's also important to note that the preamble to the modern manifesto explicitly points out that this document has evolved and continues to change and develop with the understanding that values and ideas are subject to change as knowledge and understanding advances, as well as explicitly stating that it is not laying out what all humanists must believe, but instead represents a consensus of what humanists do believe. It is a bottom-up approach that you don't see in any religion that I'm aware of. Rather than divine dictates passed down from on high that must not be questioned, it is a consensus of beliefs and values that comes from the members. And if you disagree, you don't get excommunicated. Your opinion is taken seriously and considered.
Atheists must have a logical way to explain our existence and purpose, which they define as, amongst other things, survival or fulfillment of the human race.
You actually don't need an explanation for our existence or purpose in order to be an atheist. Certainly there are many that enjoy learning about things like evolution and abiogenesis, but that is not integral to atheism. Remember, as you yourself pointed out at the beginning, atheism is not a monolith. There are all kinds of atheists out there with all kinds of opinions about things like our purpose. Specific to humanism, our purpose is to make life as good as possible for as many people as possible, and that certainly is a goal that I can agree with. But there won't be universal agreement on that from everyone to whom the label atheist could be applied.
And that explanation of their ideology is formatted and codified in the teaching of the story of evolution.
Humanists accept evolution because one of the fundamental aspects of humanism is the understanding that knowledge is derived through science, as science has shown itself to be the most consistently reliable method for learning about reality. Evolution is not fundamental to humanism. Right now, it is included in humanism because it is the scientific consensus that it is a real thing that happens. But if the scientific consensus were to swing away from evolution at some point, humanism would also swing away from evolution. It's just that, as evolution is the foundation of our modern understanding of biology, it is incredibly unlikely that it will ever be shown to be false at this point.
The evolutionist Kirkut defined the general theory of evolution as the theory that all the living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form.
Yeah, well, maybe when defining evolution, you shouldn't go to a book from the 60s that most biologists of the time heavily criticized, and instead go to something like Berkeley's Understanding Evolution website, which is widely regarded as a great resource for the non-scientist to learn the basics of evolution. Its definition of evolution is descent with inherited modification. But I guess you need to go to Kirkut's book if you want to try and include abiogenesis as part of evolution, because all the other evolutionary biologists will tell you that it's not. Evolution is about what happens to life that is already there. How it got there is entirely irrelevant. A god could have started it for all evolution cares, but once it's there, descent with inherited modification is a thing that happens.
And this basic framework is what is taught throughout the West's state-funded education systems.
Yes, evolution is taught in schools. But it is taught in schools because of the same reason that it's included in humanism. It is a true thing that happens. It is not taught in schools because schools are trying to subvert parents by teaching religious humanism, and evolution is a part of that. It's just that evolution happens, so schools teach it, and humanists accept it.
For example, in a key 1995 statement, the National Association of Biology Teachers in the US said, "The diversity of life on Earth is the outcome of evolution, an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural process of temporal descent, with genetic modification that is affected by natural selection, chance, historical contingencies, and changing environments."
So that is another document that has gone through several iterations over the years. He's supposedly quoting the 1995 version, but nothing close to that quote is in the 95 document. After looking through the 1980, 1995, 2000, 2008, and 2011 versions of that statement, the closest thing to that I could find was in the 2000 version, which says, quote, "The diversity of life on Earth is the outcome of evolution, an unpredictable and natural process of temporal descent with genetic modification that is affected by natural selection, chance, historical contingencies, and changing environments." This is important because they appear to have added unsupervised and impersonal to the quote in order to make it seem hostile to religion. But it is not. On the existence of God, it says, quote, "Evolutionary theory, indeed all of science, is necessarily silent on religion and neither refutes nor supports the existence of a deity or deities." I've seen plenty of context removal from the people at AIG, but I think this is the first time that I've ever caught them blatantly modifying a quote. And as I often do when pointing out one of their lies, I will now mention that they have an article up on their website right now explaining that it is wrong to lie to a Nazi to save a Jew. Though I will also point out that since I began regularly referencing the Bodhi Hodge article called A Righteous Lie, the URL to his article now redirects to one that is not quite as blatant as he was. Rather than saying that God might have a plan for the Jew that you were hiding in the concentration camp that he'll wind up in as a result of your truthfulness, it is now an article about how you can be deceptive without lying. Instead of hiding the Jew, answer the door with him at your side and then demand that the Nazis search your house, asking, "Do you think I'm stupid enough to do that?" So, I guess at least they're trying to cover up their hardline stance on not lying by making a suggestion about how you could still protect the person instead of selling them out, but they still come down on the side of avoiding lying at all costs, and it shows that they are willing to stretch their definitions in order to be deceptive without technically lying. However, in the case of the quote that we just saw, they just straight up lied. And side note, when I saw that they got rid of Bodhi's article on lying, I got a bit of an ego boost, thinking that maybe they noticed me referencing it so frequently, so maybe I caused them to take it down. But then I remembered a bit of hot goss regarding Bodhi. You see, he has been putting up with Ken Ham treating him like shit in public for years, and as Ken Ham's son-in-law, he was likely tolerating that for the hope that he would inherit Answers in Genesis when Ken either retired or died. Well, Ken announced a few months ago that he would be retiring and that a guy named Martin Iles would be taking over for him. This seemed to have caused a bit of a schism, with Bodie leaving to start his own creationist ministry with blackjack and hookers. And their schism was apparently contentious enough that every mention of Bodie has been completely scrubbed from the AIG website, to the extent where searching for his name yields 0 results. There are other people who have left AIG whose articles are still up and who still have biographies published, like the aforementioned Martin Iles, who, after accepting his role at AIG as fresh ham, proceeded to part ways with them to start his own creationist ministry with blackjack and hookers. But he's still all over the AIG site. What I wouldn't give to have been a fly on the wall during some of Bodie's conversations there. Anyway, that is all irrelevant. I just wanted to spill the tea.
Because the story of evolution has been adopted as the official explanation for our origins, what is actually being taught in the state-run schools is the religion of secular humanism.
Incorrect. This would be like saying that teaching about gravity in physics class is the same as teaching the religion of Christianity, because after all, most Christians believe that gravity is a thing, though amusingly the small number of those who don't believe in gravity, the flat earthers, tend to also be young earth creationists. I know AIG hates that association, but maybe they should consider why it is that such a vehemently anti-science group, which they would agree are vehemently anti-science, are also attracted to their creationist teachings.
All funded by taxpayers, I might add, many of whom are Christians and people of other faiths.
Yeah, well, when you bring up things like that, you tend to forget that churches not paying tax is a form of subsidy that burdens the taxpayers. So there is plenty of creationist teaching that is taxpayer funded. It's just not the kind of funding where the government cuts you a check, so y'all pretend that that's not the same thing, but really it is. And it's cute that you're pretending to care about people of other faiths, especially when you opened the video talking about how horrible it would be to have to send your kids to a Muslim school. You are now advocating for including not just Christianity, but your specific flavor of Christianity into the public school curriculum, thus forcing people of other faiths to allow their kids to be indoctrinated into your faith. If you don't see why that's a problem, then you're being willfully obtuse.
It's an ingenious strategy that humanists have employed for years now. Infiltrate and control the so-called public education system, which is supposed to be neutral, and impose their religion as science to convert millions to their own faith. And, as I mentioned, mostly at the expense of their opposition.
I don't think that's actually happening, but teaching facts about reality as neutrality seems perfectly fine to me. Remember, the core aspect of humanism that he's taking issue with here is the use of science to learn about nature. He's telling you it's specifically evolution, and yes, the idea that we are all the result of unguided evolutionary change is in the Humanist manifesto, but the way to teach it neutrally is to not mention anything about guidance one way or the other while teaching it. That way, the religious students are free to assume that their God was the guiding force behind evolution, and the irreligious ones are free to assume that it was unguided. And that is the way it is supposed to be taught. I would be just as annoyed at a teacher insisting to their students that evolution is unguided as one that insists that it is guided.
To put it bluntly, the West overtly teaches atheism to its young minds, and has been doing so for decades now.
Nope. It teaches evolution, which is known to be true, and it just so happens that secular humanism also made an acceptance of evolution part of their shtick. That does not mean that teaching evolution is the equivalent of teaching secular humanism or atheism. It just so happens that reality itself does not contradict secular humanism, and so teaching reality does not automatically preclude secular humanism like it does for creationism.
Is it any wonder that we see the outright madness displayed in culture today?
I mean, most of that is a result of Christian nationalism combined with xenophobia and racism. Oh, wait, you're not talking about the American Gestapo, that is ICE, doing things like using children as bait to deport their parents, or the Trump regime deploying the military against civilian protesters in California against the wishes of the governor, or that the explicitly Christian nationalist agenda known as Project 2025 is 42% complete according to Project 2025.observer. You're talking about the fact that trans people exist. Yeah. That's where the focus needs to be right now, sure. Let the civil rights of anyone who isn't white enough get trampled, as long as we can also trample the rights of LGBTQ people.
Even despite the cold, hard facts right in front of their own eyes, such as the statistics that I mentioned earlier, Many Christians I've spoken with continue in denial of what our so-called education system has become, a humanist indoctrination center.
The only statistics you mentioned earlier were the ones that you appear to have made up, as none of the real ones differentiated between Christian or other religious schools and secular schools, so there is no reason to ignore them. And honestly, if you have a problem with kids being taught humanist principles like respect people and enrich the lives of those around you, then I don't want you having any influence on what my kids are taught.
And yet, many humanists don't even hide their purpose and strategy to convert young people, especially children from Christian homes, to their faith.
Yeah, you know what? I do hope that young people, even those from Christian homes, grow up to be good people with empathy and caring for their fellow human beings. I know that sounds terrible to you, but that's a you problem.
For example, here's a writer from the Journal of the American Humanist Association openly admitting that the public education system is their primary mechanism for doing so. I'm convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly view their role as the proselytizers of a new faith. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism.
Yep. Some guy who owns a bookstore in Illinois sure did write that sentiment one time. Doesn't really make it a national program of humanist indoctrination, though, does it?
And to emphasize that this program was well thought out and implemented long ago, look at this statement from the humanist Charles Potter from 1930. Education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every American public school is a school of humanism. What can the theistic Sunday schools, meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children, do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching?
And if we continue reading past that quote, we find that he was not actually advocating for the teaching of religious humanism, but rather is acknowledging that education is inherently humanistic. Quote, "So very humanistic is modern education that no religion has a future unless it be humanism. The religion of tomorrow in America and of the day after tomorrow in all the world may not be in all respects identical with the religious humanism we are advocating in this book, but it will be mightily like it and of the same spirit."
Humanists understood that if you could access young minds while they were separated from their parents' influence for the majority of the day, and institute humanist teachings to proselytize them with their own faith position, then it would outweigh those young people's religious teaching by more than 10 to 1, literally drowning them in humanistic religious ideas.
Yeah, so here's the thing, though. In order to come up with the idea that humanism is infiltrating the public education in a systematic and intentional manner, you had to pull up quotes from an author from the 1930s and a bookstore owner who was briefly a teacher at a community college from the 1980s. But in order for me to say that Christianity is infiltrating the public education in a systematic and intentional manner, I can pull up legislation passed in places like Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana and quote people like the goddamn President of the United States, who said in November of last year, quote, "We will support bringing back prayer to our schools." Or I could point out that Trump signed an executive order that directs the Department of Education to provide funding to faith-based private schools. So you can claim that we are infiltrating classrooms all you want, but your supporting evidence for that comes from people who have zero power to do anything significant regarding school curriculums, the most recent of which is nearly 4 decades ago. Well, I can point to literally the most powerful person on the planet today actively and explicitly working to push your religion into classrooms. So who, given this evidence, is actually infiltrating the classrooms, I wonder?
Not only do they promote their own religion, but humanists actively undermine other faiths, especially what was once the dominant in the West, Christianity, to further their entrenchment and influence. All while, as I said before, parents paid them for the privilege of doing so through their tax dollars. For example, Princeton University professor of philosophy, Richard Rorty, who likely influenced thousands of young students who moved on to influential positions in culture, said the following: "The fundamentalist parents of our fundamentalist students think that the entire American liberal establishment is engaged in a conspiracy. The parents have a point. We do our best to convince these students of the benefits of secularization. So we are going to go right on trying to discredit you in the eyes of your children, trying to strip your fundamentalist religious community of dignity, trying to make your views seem silly rather than discussable."
So again, you're quoting a guy who's a teacher, not someone in a position to influence school curriculums other than his own. And yes, teaching reality does undermine a lot of religious fundamentalism. Once again, though, that's not reality's fault.
Christian parents need to understand that just as they truly feel that their faith is of utmost importance and they would like to see everyone come to have saving faith in Jesus as their Savior and Redeemer, so do humanists believe that their faith is what all humans should adopt, as they believe its principles are what is best for the fulfillment of the human race.
The difference is that humanists don't care if you tack humanist ideals onto other faiths. The important thing is the outcome, that life is better for more people. If you can help make life better for more people while staying a Christian, then fine, stay Christian. But when you are adamant that minorities that you don't like shouldn't have equal rights and should be subject to things like conversion therapy, which the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims has determined does amount to torture, then that's a problem. And if you need to ditch Christianity in order to avoid advocating for the torture of children, then ditching Christianity is a good thing.
However, with no absolute moral standard to uphold, they're certainly not above using subversive tactics to accomplish their goals.
Says the guy in the video where he manipulated a quote to make it look worse so that he could score some rhetorical points.
An example comes from an article by Boris Zivkovic, who used to be the online community manager at PLOS ONE, an open access journal from the Public Library of Science. In it, he openly admits and approves of teaching what he calls known inaccuracies to students to convert them to believing the story of evolution.
So, not a humanist then?
And he begins by cautioning other humanists in their approach in doing so, outlining that they should be patient and deliberate in how they subvert their students' belief systems. You cannot bludgeon kids with truth or insult their religion, i.e. their parents and friends, and hope they will smile and believe you. Yes, NOMA is wrong, but is a good first tool for gaining trust. You have to bring them over to your side, gain their trust, and then hold their hands and help them step by step.
Yeah, in the post reference, he never once mentions anything about humanism. It just looks like you're conflating an acceptance of evolution with humanism. But also, it should be pointed out that the inaccuracy that he's talking about is the teaching of the NOMA concept, that is, non-overlapping magisteria, which is the idea that science and religion are compatible because they speak to different and non-overlapping aspects of reality. He doesn't think that that is the case, but he's willing to teach kids that science doesn't threaten their religion in order to be able to teach them science without the visceral pushback that would come if he were overtly hostile to the religion of their friends and family.
He then admits that lying to young people is acceptable as a means to his endgame.
And the lie that he's admitting to is that science and religion are compatible. I thought AIG's whole thing was that true science supports religion. Or is that a lie that AIG is willing to admit to? Because if you actually believe that science supports religion, then finding a teacher who is willing to teach that science and religion are compatible should be exciting to you.
Despite what even many Christian leaders espouse, the topic of biblical creation, described in Genesis 1-11, is not a side issue, because the real topic it relates to is that of biblical authority in its entirety.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. If there's a disagreement between the Bible and reality, that's not reality's problem.
Genesis is the seedbed of all Christian doctrines, directly or indirectly, as it provides the foundation for the entire reason for the need of Christ's coming.
If you need Christ's coming, then you might have a breeding kink. But the foundation that he's talking about is that a talking snake with legs convinced a woman made out of a guy's rib that eating fruit would somehow impart knowledge of good and evil directly into her head, and knowledge of good and evil is a bad thing to have, so God punished the woman by making childbirth painful, he punished the man by making weeds grow, and he punished the snakes by removing their legs. Yes, I know AIG will tell you that the serpent was actually Satan in disguise, but that whole crawl on your belly thing doesn't make sense as a punishment for a demonic being, and they like to say that this story is one that you can take literally, interpreting it as plainly written. And it is plainly a snake that is being punished by having to crawl on its belly. There is no mention of any demonic beings in the story. The snake is described as just being the most crafty of the beasts of the field, not a fallen angel.
And as the psalmist warned, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Psalm 11, verse 3. Humanists understand that to impose their worldview, they must attempt to tear down the very concept of the Creator God of the Bible and dominate the origins issue by mandating the story of evolution above all else.
Except, once again, let me remind you that evolution is not synonymous with humanism or atheism. It is just a biological reality, and there are plenty of religious people who accept it. Also, let me remind you that he opened this video showing an awareness that atheism is by no means a monolith, and yet here we are with him equating evolution with humanism and insisting that humanism is the monolithic form of atheism. It really is quite remarkable. And that's basically it. He reiterates a few points that he made earlier, but I'm calling it here. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Accidental Ninja, who says, "How much is all this merchandise you're hawking worth?" A shilling. Love me a good dad joke. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole, though that's going to be a bit sporadic while I'm off on holiday for a couple weeks. Thanks to Piper for being my editor, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the humanists that terrify the creationist that is my channel. If you'd like to be a good person, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. That's right, only good people join my Patreon, and everyone who's not a patron is not a good person. You're not a good person unless you give me money. Or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.viceround.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my PO box address is in the description. See you next time! That was a weird way to do the outro, but I did it. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wings. The power and love of God is an awesome God. My partner just sent me an image that I can't see what all the text on it is, but the big bold text is, "She comes to you when it's hard. She tells you about relational aggression, friendship, drama, and social struggle because she trusts you to be her lighthouse, not her judge." Okay, this is a mushy thing that started out sounding sexy. Bait and switch. Fucking bait and switch.